I'm Sienna, and I'm 28. I just caught my younger brothers treating my apartment like their personal hotel while emptying my fridge and leaving me to clean up their mess. They actually told someone, "She cleans after, don't worry." But I'm getting ahead of myself. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt taken for granted by family. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me take you back to where this all started. I've been working since I was 16, not because my family needed the money, but because I wanted something that was mine. While other kids were hanging out at the mall, I was stocking shelves at the local grocery store, saving every penny like my life depended on it. And you know what? In a way, it did. By the time I graduated college, I had managed to save enough money to feel confident about my future. Most of my friends were drowning in student debt, but I had worked my way through school and graduated debt-free. I know, what a concept, right? Actually paying for things instead of expecting someone else to handle it. When I got offered a position at a marketing firm in New York City with a salary that made my eyes water, I knew this was my chance. The job was everything I had worked toward. Strategic marketing for luxury brands, the kind of position that would set up my entire career. The only catch was relocating across the country to Manhattan within 6 weeks. While my parents worried about me moving so far away, and my brothers acted like I was abandoning the family, I was quietly thrilled. Finally, a chance to build something that was completely mine, in a city where nobody knew me as the responsible older sister, who always had everything together. The apartment hunting process in New York was like a nightmare reality show. Closet-sized spaces for astronomical prices, buildings that looked like they might collapse in a strong wind, and landlords who acted like they were doing you a favor by taking your money. But after 3 weeks of searching, I found it. A beautiful 2-bedroom apartment on the Upper West Side with hardwood floors, enormous windows, and a view that actually included some greenery instead of just brick walls. It was more expensive than anything I had ever imagined paying for housing, but it was perfect. And more importantly, I could afford it. The day I signed the lease, sitting in that realtor's office with my own checkbook, writing my own deposit check, I felt like I had won the lottery. This wasn't my parents' house or a shared college dorm or a cramped apartment with 3 roommates. This was mine. When I called my family to tell them about the apartment, their reactions were exactly what I expected. Mom worried about me living alone in such a big, expensive city. Dad questioned whether I was being financially responsible. My younger brothers, Jake and Mason, barely seemed to register the news beyond asking if they could visit sometime. Little did I know that casual question about visiting would eventually become the source of my biggest regret about moving to New York. The apartment came furnished with custom built-ins and a kitchen that looked like something out of a design magazine. But having furniture and making a place feel like home are 2 completely different things, and I was determined to turn this beautiful space into something that reflected who I was. I spent my first weekend in the city wandering through furniture stores, art galleries, and little boutiques in Soho, slowly collecting pieces that spoke to me. A vintage coffee table that I found at a flea market in Brooklyn. Original artwork from a struggling painter in Greenwich Village who reminded me of myself at 22, hungry and determined to make it in an impossible city. The bookshelf in the living room filled up with novels I had been meaning to read for years but never had time for. The kitchen got stocked with actual cooking supplies instead of just takeout containers. I even bought plants, which was a big step for someone who had killed a cactus in college. Every evening after work, I would come home to this space that was entirely my creation and feel this deep sense of satisfaction. I had built this. I had earned this. Every throw pillow and piece of artwork represented hours of work, careful budgeting, and a vision of the life I wanted to create. The view from my living room window became my daily meditation. I could see a small park across the street where dog walkers gathered every morning and families brought their children to play on weekends. It felt like watching a movie of the life that was happening outside while I built my own story inside. My work life was everything I had hoped it would be. The company specialized in luxury brand marketing, and I was working with clients whose names would make your grandmother jealous. High-end jewelry, exclusive fashion lines, boutique hotels that charged more per night than some people made in a week. It was fast-paced, demanding, and absolutely perfect for someone who had spent years preparing to work harder than everyone else. The commute was exactly what you'd expect in Manhattan, a journey that involved subway trains, crowds of people, and the occasional delay that made you question your life choices. But somehow, even the stressful commute felt like part of the adventure. I was living in New York City, working my dream job, and coming home to an apartment that felt like a sanctuary. For 2 whole years, this was my life. Work hard during the day, come home to my beautiful space in the evening, spend weekends exploring the city, or just enjoying the luxury of having nowhere to be except exactly where I wanted to be. I had dinner parties with co-workers who became friends. I discovered the best coffee shop in my neighborhood and became a regular who got greeted by name. I found a dry cleaner who did excellent work and a grocery store that stayed open late enough for my schedule. It sounds simple when I describe it like that, but for someone who had spent most of her life being responsible for other people's problems and needs, having a space that was entirely my own felt revolutionary. I decorated the second bedroom as a home office/guest room, thinking maybe someday my parents would visit or I might have a friend stay over. The room had a daybed with beautiful pillows and a small desk where I could work on personal projects or just pay bills in peace. Looking back now, I can see that those 2 years were the calm before the storm. I was living in my own little bubble of independence and success, completely unprepared for how quickly that peace could be shattered by family who saw my good fortune as their opportunity. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in late August. I was making dinner in my kitchen, actually cooking for once instead of ordering takeout, when my mom called with news that would change everything. "Sienna, honey, I have exciting news. Jake and Mason both got accepted to Columbia. They'll be starting classes in September. Columbia University, in New York City, 15 minutes from my apartment." My first reaction was genuine excitement for my brothers. They were both smart kids who had worked hard in school, and getting into Columbia was no small achievement. But my second reaction, the one I tried to push down, was a sinking feeling that my peaceful New York life was about to get complicated. "That's wonderful, Mom. I'm so proud of them." "Well, here's the thing," she continued, and I could hear that tone that meant she was about to ask for something. "The dorms don't open until the week before classes start, but orientation is next week. They'll need somewhere to stay for about 10 days. And there it was. The request I had somehow seen coming the moment she mentioned Columbia. "Of course," I heard myself saying, because what else could I say? "They can stay with me." When Jake and Mason arrived that following Saturday, dragging enormous suitcases and looking both excited and overwhelmed, I felt that familiar mix of love and responsibility that had defined our relationship since they were kids. They were 20 and 21 now, but they still looked like the little boys I used to help with homework. "Sienna, this place is incredible," Mason said, walking around my living room like he was touring a museum. "You really live here all by yourself?" Jake was already examining my bookshelves, pulling out titles and making comments about my taste in literature. "Very sophisticated, sister. Very adult." I showed them around the apartment, gave them fresh towels, and set them up in my guest room with air mattresses I borrowed from my neighbor. The plan was simple. They would stay with me for the week and a half until their dorm opened. I would help them get oriented to the city, and then they would move into campus housing and we would all get back to our normal lives. Those first few days were actually wonderful. I took time off work to show them around Manhattan. We went to museums and restaurants, and we spent evenings in my living room watching movies and talking about their excitement for starting college in the city. It felt like the kind of family bonding that we had never really had when we were growing up. The night before they were supposed to move into their dorm, we were having pizza on my couch when Jake brought up something that should have been a red flag. "You know, Sienna, this apartment is so much nicer than the dorm is going to be, and so much quieter." "Well, dorm life is part of the college experience," I said. "You'll love it once you get settled." "But what if we needed to come here sometimes? Just to study or get away from the chaos?" Mason jumped in. "Yeah, like on weekends when there are parties and we need somewhere quiet to work on papers." And because I loved them, and because I remembered how stressful college could be, and because I genuinely wanted to help them succeed, I made the decision that would eventually lead to me questioning every boundary I had ever set. "Of course," I said, reaching for my keychain. "Here, take copies of the keys. You can come here whenever you need a quiet place to study." The look of relief and gratitude on their faces made me feel like the best big sister in the world. What could go wrong with letting my hard-working little brothers use my apartment as a study space? Famous last words, right? The first few weeks after Jake and Mason moved into their dorm were exactly what I had expected. They would text me occasionally, stop by on Sunday afternoons to do laundry, and sometimes show up on Friday nights to crash after a long week of classes. I didn't mind the extra laundry or the fact that they ate most of my groceries when they visited. It felt good to be helpful. And honestly, it was nice to have some family around after 2 years of living completely on my own. The first real sign that things were shifting came on a Thursday evening when I got home from work to find Jake and Mason in my living room with a girl I didn't recognize. They were sprawled across my couch with textbooks and laptops everywhere, clearly in the middle of some kind of study session. "Oh, hey, Sienna," Jake said without looking up from his computer. "This is Rebecca from our economics class. We're working on a group project." Rebecca waved from her position on my floor where she was surrounded by research papers. "Thanks for letting us use your place. Jake said you wouldn't mind." I smiled and said of course it was fine, but something about the casual way Jake had made that assumption bothered me. When had we moved from, "Can we use your apartment to study," to "Jake said you wouldn't mind"? Over the next few weeks, the visits became more frequent and less predictable. I would come home to find evidence that they had been there. Dishes in the sink, different food missing from my refrigerator, towels left on the bathroom floor. Sometimes they were still there when I got home. Sometimes they had already left. The bathroom situation was what really started to annoy me. I would wake up in the morning to find wet towels thrown on the floor, toothpaste splatters on my mirror, and my shower clearly used by people who didn't live there. When I mentioned it to Mason, he apologized and promised to be more careful, but nothing really changed. Then there were the groceries. I had gotten into a routine of shopping for myself on Sunday mornings, buying exactly what I needed for the week. But I started having to make midweek grocery runs because things I had planned to cook for dinner were mysteriously missing. "Sorry, Sienna," Jake said when I asked about the missing sandwich meat and cheese. "We got hungry after studying and didn't think you'd mind." The thing is, I didn't really mind sharing food with my brothers. What bothered me was that they never asked first, never replaced what they took, and never seemed to consider that I might have been planning to use those ingredients for something specific. But the real turning point came on a Saturday morning when I woke up to find 3 people I had never met before asleep in my living room. Apparently, Jake and Mason had decided to have a small study group the night before that had turned into people just spending the night. When I walked into my kitchen to make coffee, trying to step quietly around sleeping strangers in my own home, I found my sink full of dirty dishes and my trash overflowing with empty beer bottles and pizza boxes. "Jake," I said, shaking my brother awake, "we need to talk." He sat up, rubbing his eyes, looking genuinely confused about why I seemed upset. "What's wrong?" "There are people I don't know sleeping in my living room, and my kitchen looks like a tornado hit it." "Oh, that. Sorry, the study group just kind of turned into a hangout. We'll clean up before we leave." But they didn't clean up before they left. Not really. They took the pizza boxes to the trash and put the dishes in the dishwasher, but they didn't wipe down the counters or pick up all the bottle caps that had somehow ended up scattered across my floor. I spent my Saturday morning cleaning my own apartment after people I didn't know had made themselves at home in my space. That should have been when I set clearer boundaries. That should have been when I had a serious conversation about the difference between using the apartment to study and treating it like a second dorm room. Instead, I convinced myself that they were just adjusting to college life, that they didn't really understand how their behavior was affecting me, and that things would settle down once they got more comfortable with their campus routine. I was so wrong. By October, my apartment had essentially become an extension of their dorm. Jake and Mason weren't just coming over to study anymore. They were bringing friends, staying overnight without asking, and treating my refrigerator like their personal meal plan. The breaking point almost came on a Wednesday when I got home from a particularly stressful day at work to find a full-blown party happening in my living room. Music playing, people I didn't recognize drinking beer from my cups, and my coffee table covered in what appeared to be the remains of several takeout orders. "Sienna!" Mason called out cheerfully when he saw me standing in my own doorway. "Perfect timing! Come meet everyone!" I looked around my living room at the dozen or so college students who had clearly been there for hours, based on the level of mess and the fact that several of them were already pretty drunk. "Can I talk to you in the kitchen?" I said to Mason, my voice carefully controlled. In the kitchen, which was somehow even messier than the living room, I tried to explain that I couldn't have random parties in my apartment without any notice. "It's not a party," Mason protested. "It's just a few people hanging out after study group. There are 12 people here and half of them are drinking. Okay, maybe it got a little bigger than planned, but everyone will be gone soon and we'll clean up everything. I promise." The promise to clean up everything turned out to mean putting the empty bottles in recycling and loading the dishwasher. The sticky spots on my hardwood floors, the ring stains on my coffee table, and the mysterious smell coming from my bathroom were apparently not part of everything. I started finding evidence of their visits even when I wasn't there to witness them. My expensive shampoo would be nearly empty after being full the day before. My favorite coffee would be gone. My clean sheets would be wrinkled like someone had been sleeping in my bed. The worst part was how they acted like none of this was a big deal. When I mentioned the missing coffee, Jake would offer to buy me a new container sometime. When I pointed out the bathroom mess, Mason would apologize and say he forgot to clean up after his shower. They treated every complaint like an isolated incident rather than part of a pattern. Meanwhile, their friends started treating my apartment like it was community property too. People would show up when Jake and Mason weren't even there, claiming they had said it was okay to use the place to study. Excuse me, I said to a girl I found doing homework in my living room on a Thursday afternoon. "Are Jake and Mason here?" "No, but they said I could come here to work on my paper since the library is so crowded today." I had become the unwilling proprietor of a private study space for Columbia students. But what really pushed me toward my breaking point was how my own living situation started to deteriorate. I couldn't relax in my own home because I never knew who might be there or what kind of mess I might find. I started staying late at work just to avoid dealing with whatever chaos might be waiting for me. My beautiful, peaceful sanctuary that I had worked so hard to create was turning into a source of constant stress. And my brothers? They seemed completely oblivious to how their behavior was affecting me. When I tried to talk to them about boundaries, they would nod and agree and apologize, but nothing would actually change. "We really appreciate everything you do for us," Jake said, after I complained about finding my shower completely clogged with hair that definitely wasn't mine. "You're the best big sister ever. The best big sister ever." That phrase should have been a compliment, but instead it felt like a trap, because apparently being the best big sister ever meant never setting limits, never complaining too much, and always being available to clean up after other people. I just didn't realize yet how much worse it was going to get. The end came on a Tuesday morning in November that started like any other weekday. I had set my alarm for 6:30, planning to shower and grab breakfast before heading to work for an important client presentation. But as I was getting dressed in my bedroom, I heard voices coming from my living room. Male voices and at least one female voice, talking quietly, but clearly not trying to be silent. I checked my clock. 7:15 in the morning on a Tuesday. Who was in my apartment at 7:15 on a Tuesday morning? I finished getting dressed and was about to go investigate when I heard Jake's voice clearly through my bedroom wall. He was talking to someone, and what he said made my blood run cold. "Don't worry about the mess. She cleans after. She doesn't mind. She cleans after. She doesn't mind." I stood in my bedroom, listening to my brother tell some girl that I would clean up whatever mess they left because I didn't mind. As if my feelings about cleaning up after them had ever been consulted. As if my preferences mattered less than their convenience. I heard more conversation, something about needing to hurry to get to class, and then the sound of my front door opening and closing. They were leaving without even saying goodbye, without acknowledging that they had spent the night in my apartment while I was sleeping in the next room. When I finally emerged from my bedroom, the scene in my living room was exactly what I expected, and somehow still shocking. Blankets and pillows thrown everywhere, wet towels draped over my furniture, empty food containers scattered across my coffee table. In the kitchen, I found my refrigerator completely empty except for condiments and a half-empty carton of milk. Everything I had bought for the week was gone. My bread, my lunch meat, my leftovers from dinner the night before, even my expensive Greek yogurt that I had been saving for breakfast. But it was the laundry room that finally broke something inside me. There, sitting in a plastic bag next to my washing machine, was a collection of dirty clothes that definitely didn't belong to me. Someone, probably Jake, had brought their dirty laundry for me to wash along with everything else I was apparently expected to handle. I sat down on my couch, surrounded by the evidence of how thoroughly my brothers had taken over my life, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: genuine anger. Not frustration or disappointment or the mild annoyance I had been swallowing for months. Real, clean anger at the assumption that my time, my space, my groceries, and my labor were available for their use without consideration or compensation. "She cleans after. She doesn't mind." The casual dismissal in those words was breathtaking. Months of trying to be understanding, of making excuses for their behavior, of convincing myself that they just needed time to adjust to college life. And this was how they saw me, as someone who existed to clean up their messes. I picked up my phone and typed out a text message: "Don't come here anymore." Then I sent it to both of them. Neither of them responded, which somehow made it even worse. I called in sick to work, something I had never done for anything short of actual illness, and spent the day cleaning my own apartment and thinking about what I was going to do next. Because if there's one thing I had learned from working since I was 16 and building a life completely on my own, it's that you teach people how to treat you. And I had been teaching my brothers that they could treat me like hired help in my own home. That was about to change. What do you think will happen next? Drop your predictions in the comments below while I tell you about the decision that changed everything. You know that feeling when you finally had enough? When something clicks in your brain and you realize you don't have to keep accepting unacceptable behavior just because it's coming from family? That's exactly where I was sitting in my destroyed living room, staring at that bag of dirty laundry they expected me to wash. I had two choices: keep being the doormat big sister who cleaned up everyone else's messes, or do something that would actually solve this problem permanently. And since talking to them had accomplished absolutely nothing, it was time for action. The first thing I did was start researching apartments closer to my office. I had been commuting an hour each way to Manhattan every day, which was exhausting and expensive, but I had stayed in my current place because I loved it. Well, I used to love it. Now it felt contaminated by months of being treated like a hotel with maid service. The apartment search in New York is always brutal, But this time I knew exactly what I was looking for. I wanted something modern, clean, and far enough from Columbia that my brothers couldn't just casually drop by whenever they felt like it. I also wanted something closer to my office, so I could reclaim those 2 hours a day I'd been spending on subway platforms. It took me 3 weeks of weekend apartment hunting, but I found the perfect place. A gorgeous 2-bedroom in Midtown with floor-to-ceiling windows, a doorman, and yes, a jacuzzi in the master bathroom. It was larger than my old place, with better amenities and a second bedroom I could use as a proper home office. It was more expensive than my current place, but my salary had increased twice since I moved to New York, and I could afford it. The best part? It was a 45-minute subway ride from Columbia. Close enough that I wasn't completely cutting off my brothers, but far enough that they couldn't treat it like their personal crash pad. The timing worked out perfectly because Jake and Mason mentioned they were going home for Thanksgiving week to visit our parents. A whole week where they would be out of state and completely distracted by family obligations. I took that entire week off from work and hired professional movers to relocate my entire life while my brothers were 3,000 miles away. The moving process was oddly therapeutic. Packing up all my belongings, seeing my furniture loaded into trucks, watching my beautiful apartment get emptied of everything that made it mine. It felt like shedding skin, leaving behind a version of myself that had been too accommodating for too long. My new apartment was everything I had hoped for. Much larger than my old place, with better light, modern appliances, and that incredible bathroom with the jacuzzi that made me feel like I was living in a luxury hotel. The building had a gym, a rooftop terrace, and most importantly, a doorman who would never let random college students wander around looking for my apartment. But the real stroke of luck came when I was finalizing the lease transfer for my old apartment. The landlord mentioned that his mother-in-law was looking for a place for her daughter, who was a police officer and wanted to live in that neighborhood. A police officer. Perfect. I met Officer Sarah Rodriguez the day before I officially moved out. She was in her early 30s, professional, clean, and thrilled about the apartment. She had been living with her mother while saving money, and this place was exactly what she had been hoping to find. My husband is also in law enforcement, she mentioned while we were reviewing the lease. He's a detective. We've been looking for a place in this area for months. Even more perfect. Sarah and her detective husband moved in the same week I moved out, which meant there was zero overlap between my brothers having access and new tenants taking over. It was seamless, professional, and exactly what I needed. I spent my first weekend in my new apartment just enjoying the peace. No unexpected visitors, no mysterious food disappearing, no wet towels on my bathroom floor. Just me, my beautiful new space, and the satisfaction of knowing I had solved my problem without having to have another useless conversation about boundaries. The apartment was close enough to my office that I could walk to work on nice days. I had extra time in the mornings and evenings because my commute had been cut in half. I could actually use my kitchen for cooking instead of constantly restocking groceries that disappeared overnight. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. I didn't tell Jake and Mason about the move while they were visiting our parents. They had their phones, they could have called or texted, but they were apparently too busy enjoying being home to check in with their big sister, which was fine with me because it gave me time to get fully settled before they returned to New York and discovered that their personal hotel had suddenly changed ownership. My new life was better in every way. Better apartment, shorter commute, more free time, and most importantly, complete control over who had access to my space. I was finally ready to see how they would handle the reality of their actions having consequences. When Jake and Mason returned from Thanksgiving break, it took them 3 days to realize something had changed. 3 whole days, which tells you exactly how much they had been thinking about me while they were gone. The first sign that they had discovered my old apartment was no longer available came in the form of confused text messages. Jake: "Hey, my key isn't working. Are you home?" Mason: "Did you change the locks or something? I can't get in." I was sitting in my new living room, enjoying my morning coffee and the incredible view from my floor-to-ceiling windows when those messages came through, and I felt absolutely no guilt about ignoring them. An hour later, my phone started ringing. Jake first, then Mason, then Jake again. I let every call go to voicemail. Finally, around noon, Mason sent a text that actually made me laugh out loud. "Sienna, seriously, what's going on? There are strangers in your apartment." Strangers in my apartment. As if Sarah and her husband were trespassing instead of legal tenants paying rent to live in their own home. I waited until evening to respond, keeping my message simple. "I moved. I told you both not to come there anymore." The explosion of phone calls and texts that followed was immediate and predictable. "What do you mean you moved? Where are you living now? Why didn't you tell us? We need to talk." And my personal favorite from Jake: "This is really immature, Sienna. Immature. Because taking control of my own living situation after months of being treated like hired help was immature. but assuming you have unlimited access to someone else's home without asking was perfectly reasonable adult behavior. I turned off my phone and spent the evening setting up my home office in the second bedroom, which had perfect natural light and enough space for a proper desk setup. The silence was blissful. The next morning, I had 17 voicemails and 43 text messages. Instead of listening to them or reading through the digital tantrum, I blocked both of their numbers. Not permanently, just temporarily. I needed some space to enjoy my new life without constant harassment about how unfair I was being for not wanting to provide free housing and maid service to two grown men. Work became my sanctuary in a different way than it had been before. Instead of staying late to avoid chaos at home, I was excited to get home to my peaceful apartment where everything was exactly as I had left it. I joined a gym near my office and started taking evening yoga classes. I cooked elaborate dinners just because I could, knowing that all the ingredients would still be there when I wanted them. I invited coworkers over for wine and conversation in my beautiful living room that stayed clean after guests left. It was the life I had always wanted but hadn't been able to fully enjoy while my apartment was essentially a satellite dorm for Columbia University. 2 weeks after blocking their numbers, I got a call from my mother. "Sienna, honey, the boys are very upset. They say you moved without telling them and now they don't have anywhere to go when they need to get away from campus." Ah, there it was. They had called in parental reinforcement. "Mom," I said calmly, "I told them not to come to my apartment anymore. They chose not to take that seriously. But sweetheart, they're your brothers. Family is supposed to help each other. Help goes both ways, Mom. When's the last time they helped me with anything?" The silence on her end told me she couldn't actually answer that question. "They're just kids trying to get through college," she said finally. "They're 20 and 21 years old, which makes them adults who can figure out their own housing situations. Sienna, I really think you're being too harsh. Can't you just give them your new address so they can apologize properly?" And there was the real reason for her call. They wanted my new address. "No, Mom, I can't. Have a good day." I hung up before she could argue further. The truth was, I missed my brothers. I missed the good parts of our relationship, the movie nights and conversations about their classes, and the feeling of being helpful to people I loved. But I didn't miss being taken for granted, and I wasn't willing to go back to that dynamic just because they were upset about facing consequences for their behavior. My new apartment was everything my old life hadn't been: peaceful, clean, and entirely under my control. I wasn't going to give that up just because admitting they'd been wrong was apparently too difficult for my brothers to handle. Christmas break came and went without a word from Jake or Mason, which should have been my first clue that they were planning something dramatic instead of actually reflecting on their behavior. But I was too busy enjoying my life to pay attention to the warning signs. My new routine was everything I had dreamed of when I first moved to New York. I woke up in my beautiful bedroom with sunlight streaming through huge windows. I made coffee in my pristine kitchen and actually had time to drink it while reading the news. My commute was short enough that I could stop for good coffee on the way to work without being late. Evenings were mine again. I cooked elaborate meals, took long baths in my incredible jacuzzi, and fell asleep in complete silence instead of wondering who might show up in my living room overnight. I had started dating someone from work, Michael, who was amazed by my apartment and couldn't understand why I had waited so long to move closer to the office. I didn't tell him about my brother's situation because it was embarrassing to admit how thoroughly I had let my family take advantage of me. The new year brought a promotion at work and a salary increase that made me feel even better about my expensive new rent. I was thriving professionally, personally, and financially. Everything in my life was finally aligned exactly the way I wanted it, which is why I should have known something was going to go wrong. The first weekend of February, I was deep asleep in my amazing new bed when my phone started ringing at 2 a.m. Unknown number, which usually means either emergency or drunk dial, and unfortunately, it was both. "Ma'am, this is Officer Williams with the NYPD. We have 2 individuals in custody who list you as their emergency contact, Jacob and Mason." I sat up instantly, my heart racing. Are they hurt? What happened? They're unharmed, but they've been arrested for breaking and entering, and both have been charged with driving under the influence. "We need you to come down to the station." Breaking and entering. My stomach dropped as I realized exactly what had happened. "Officer, can you tell me the address where this breaking and entering occurred?" He rattled off the address of my old apartment, and I closed my eyes in disbelief. "I'll be there in an hour," I said. I threw on clothes and called an Uber to the police station, my mind racing through what must have happened. They had gone to my old apartment, probably drunk after some college party, tried to use their old keys, and when that didn't work, they had forced their way into an apartment now occupied by 2 police officers. The irony was so perfect, it would have been funny if it weren't my brothers sitting in jail cells. At the police station, Officer Williams explained the situation in detail. Jake and Mason had been seen forcing open the front door of the apartment around 1:30 in the morning. They had been drinking, they had 2 female companions with them, and they were loud enough that other tenants called the police. When we arrived, Officer Williams continued, Officer Rodriguez and her husband were already detaining them at gunpoint. They had entered their home without permission in the middle of the night. Officer Rodriguez is the tenant, I explained. She and her husband moved in when I moved out. My brothers had keys to that apartment when it was mine, but I moved months ago and told them not to go there anymore. So this was a miscommunication? No, I said firmly. This was them ignoring clear boundaries I had set and assuming they could still access my old apartment whenever they wanted to. The paperwork took forever. Jake and Mason had been charged with breaking and entering criminal trespass, and both had failed breathalyzer tests when they were pulled over driving to the apartment. Their 2 friends had been released with warnings after explaining that they didn't know the situation with the apartment. By the time I left the police station, the sun was coming up and I was exhausted. Jake and Mason would spend the night in jail and see a judge in the morning for bail hearings. I could have bailed them out immediately. I had the money, and normally I would have done whatever it took to help my family in an emergency. But this wasn't really an emergency, was it? This was the natural consequence of months of refusing to respect my clearly stated boundaries. So I went home to my beautiful apartment, made coffee in my peaceful kitchen, and went back to bed. They could spend one night in jail thinking about how their actions had consequences. Maybe it would be educational. I showed up at the courthouse the next morning looking like exactly what I was, a successful professional woman who had been dragged into this mess by family members who couldn't take no for an answer. Jake and Mason looked rough. Orange jumpsuits, messy hair, and the kind of exhausted, hungover expression that comes from spending the night in jail after making spectacularly bad decisions. When they saw me walk into the courtroom, the relief on their faces was immediate and obvious. Big Sister was here to fix everything, just like always. Except I wasn't there to fix everything. I was there to make sure they understood exactly how thoroughly they had messed up. The judge was a middle-aged woman who looked like she had seen every possible version of young people making stupid choices. She reviewed their charges with the kind of weary efficiency that suggested this was just another Tuesday morning in Manhattan criminal court. Breaking and entering, criminal trespass, and driving under the influence. She read, "How do you plead?" Their lawyer, a public defender who looked barely older than they were, had clearly advised them to plead guilty to lesser charges in exchange for fines and community service. "Your Honor," I said, standing up from the gallery. "May I address the court?" The judge looked at me with mild curiosity. "Are you their attorney?" "No, Your Honor. I'm their sister and the former tenant of the apartment they broke into. I'd like to provide some context for their actions." "Proceed." I had spent the entire night thinking about what I wanted to say, and now I had the chance to make sure everyone understood exactly what had happened. "Your Honor, I moved out of that apartment 4 months ago and explicitly told both defendants not to return there. I gave them this instruction both verbally and in writing. The apartment is now legally occupied by Officer Sarah Rodriguez and her husband, who are both law enforcement professionals." The judge raised an eyebrow. "They broke into a police officer's home?" "Yes, Your Honor." While intoxicated in the middle of the night with 2 other individuals. I could see Jake and Mason trying to get my attention from the defendant's table, probably wanting me to explain that it was all a misunderstanding, that they didn't know about the new tenants, that they hadn't meant any harm, but I kept talking. I want to be clear that this was not a miscommunication or an honest mistake. I'd explicitly forbidden them from returning to that address months before this incident occurred. The judge's expression had shifted from boredom to interest. "Ms. Thompson, Your Honor." "Ms. Thompson, are you saying that the defendants knowingly violated your clearly stated instructions not to return to this address?" "That's exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor." The plea bargain suddenly became much less favorable. Instead of simple fines and community service, Jake and Mason were looking at real consequences. Significant fines, extended community service, mandatory alcohol counseling, and suspended sentences that would become active jail time if they violated any terms of their probation. When the sentencing was finished, they were released with court dates for check-ins and a list of requirements that would keep them busy for the next year. Outside the courthouse, they finally got their chance to talk to me. "Sienna, what the hell was that?" Jake demanded. "You made it sound like we're criminals." "You are criminals," I said calmly. "You committed crimes. That's literally what criminals do." "We thought it was still your apartment," Mason protested. "No, you hoped it was still my apartment. You knew I had moved, you knew I told you not to go there, and you decided to do it anyway because you've never faced real consequences for ignoring what I tell you. You set us up," Jake accused. "You moved police officers into your old apartment on purpose." The paranoid accusation was so ridiculous I almost laughed. I moved out because you two turned my life into chaos. And I rented the apartment to qualified tenants who could afford the rent and wouldn't treat it like a hotel. The fact that those tenants happen to be police officers is just perfect karma. We need your new address, Mason said. We need somewhere to go when campus gets crazy. And there it was. After everything that had happened, after spending a night in jail for breaking into my former home, they still thought they were entitled to access my new living space. No, I said simply. What do you mean, no? I mean, no, you can't have my new address. No, you can't use my new apartment as your personal escape hatch. No, I'm not going to keep enabling this behavior. Sienna, you're our sister. Yes, and you're my brothers, which means you should treat me with basic respect instead of like hired help. I turned to walk away and then stopped, realizing there was one more thing I needed to say. When you're ready to have a relationship with me that doesn't involve you taking advantage of my generosity, call me. Until then, figure out your own problems like the adults you're supposed to be. Then I got in my Uber and went home to my beautiful, peaceful apartment where no one could find me unless I wanted them to. The months that followed were the quietest my life had been since I moved to New York. No unexpected visitors, no calls demanding I solve other people's problems, no family drama seeping into my peaceful existence. I threw myself into work and discovered that when you're not constantly stressed about what chaos might be waiting for you at home, you can actually focus on building your career. I started taking on bigger clients, leading larger projects, and making the kind of professional connections that had been impossible when I was always distracted by family emergencies. Michael and I became serious enough that he started keeping clothes at my apartment, and I gave him his own key. Having someone in my space by choice, someone who respected my home and contributed to maintaining it instead of destroying it, felt revolutionary. I still can't believe your brothers broke into your old apartment, he said one evening while we were cooking dinner together in my pristine kitchen. That's insane. The insane part is that they still don't understand why I was upset about it, I replied. They think I overreacted. And it was true. The few messages I had received from my parents made it clear that Jake and Mason had spun the story to make me look like the unreasonable one. According to their version, they had made an innocent mistake, and I had vindictively pressed charges against them. The fact that they were now dealing with real consequences for the first time in their lives was apparently all my fault. My mother called occasionally, trying to guilt me into reconciling with them. They've learned their lesson, she would say. Can't you just give them another chance? But I had given them chances. Months of chances. I had tried talking to them, setting boundaries, explaining how their behavior affected me, and none of it had worked. The only thing that finally got their attention was facing actual legal consequences for their actions. And even then they were angry at me instead of taking responsibility for their choices. My father tried a different approach, calling me at work one afternoon to explain that family should stick together through difficult times. Dad, I said, I stuck with them through months of them treating my apartment like their personal hotel. I stuck with them through having my groceries stolen and my space disrespected. I stuck with them until they broke into someone else's home because they refused to accept that I had moved. At what point do I get to expect them to stick with me by treating me with basic respect? He didn't have an answer for that. The truth was, I didn't miss the stress and chaos they had brought into my life. I missed the idea of having close relationships with my brothers, but I didn't miss the reality of what those relationships had become. I was thriving in every way. My work performance had never been better. My relationship with Michael was healthy and balanced. My living situation was exactly what I had always wanted. My finances were in great shape because I wasn't constantly replacing groceries and household items that disappeared overnight. For the first time since moving to New York, I felt like I was living the life I had worked so hard to build instead of just surviving someone else's chaos. Then, on a Saturday morning in late spring, my doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my doorman usually called before sending visitors up. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Jake and Mason standing in my hallway, looking nervous and uncomfortable. Somehow, they had found my address. I considered not answering the door. I could pretend I wasn't home, let them stand there until they gave up and left. But curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to know how they had found me and what they thought they were going to accomplish by showing up unannounced. How did you get my address? I asked through the door without opening it. Sienna, please, we just want to talk, Mason said. We've been trying to reach you for months. How did you get my address? I repeated. Mom hired a private investigator, Jake admitted. We just want to apologize and explain everything. A private investigator. My own mother had hired a private investigator to find my home address so that my brothers could continue their pattern of showing up wherever I lived without permission. The irony was breathtaking. We've been going to counseling, Mason added. We understand now how our behavior affected you. I opened the door but didn't invite them in. They looked different somehow. older, more tired, like the last few months of facing real consequences had aged them. You understand how your behavior affected me? I asked. We were selfish, Jake said immediately. We treated your apartment like it was ours. We didn't respect your boundaries, and we took advantage of your generosity. The words sounded rehearsed, like they had practiced this conversation. And? I prompted. And we want to make it right, Mason said. We want to have a relationship with you again. I looked at these two young men who were supposed to be my baby brothers, who I had loved and supported and tried to help, who had responded to my generosity by treating me like hired help. What kind of relationship? I asked. A normal one, Jake said. Brother and sister who care about each other. What does that look like exactly? They exchanged glances, clearly not expecting me to ask for specifics. We could have dinner sometimes, Mason suggested. Talk on the phone. You could give us advice about life stuff. And where would these dinners happen? Restaurants, Jake said quickly. We wouldn't ask to come to your apartment. I almost smiled. They had learned that much at least. What about when you need somewhere to study or get away from campus? Another exchanged glance. We'd figure it out ourselves, Mason said. And if you need money or help with something, we'd ask, not assume, Jake said. And we'd accept no as an answer. They were saying all the right words, but I had heard them say the right words before. The difference this time was that they had spent months dealing with actual consequences for their actions, and maybe that had taught them something that my conversations never could. I need to think about it, I said finally. They nodded, both looking relieved that I hadn't immediately slammed the door. We miss you, Mason said quietly. We miss our sister. I miss them too, but I miss the brothers I thought I had, not the ones who had treated me like a doormat. I'll call you, I said, if I decide I'm ready to try this again. After they left, I sat in my beautiful, peaceful apartment and tried to figure out whether people really could change, or if I was just setting myself up for another cycle of disappointment. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more stories about standing up for yourself when family takes you for granted. 3 weeks passed before I called Jake and Mason. 3 weeks of thinking about whether I wanted to risk the peace I had built for the possibility of having real relationships with my brothers. Michael thought I should give them a chance. People can change when they face real consequences, he said. And it sounds like they've actually faced some consequences for the first time in their lives. My mother was thrilled when I told her I was considering reconciliation. My father said he always knew we would work things out because family was too important to throw away over misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. Right. I decided to meet them for lunch at a restaurant in Midtown, neutral territory where I could leave if the conversation went badly. They were already there when I arrived, sitting at a table near the window, looking nervous and excited. They stood up when they saw me, and for a moment it felt like old times, like the brothers I remembered from before everything went wrong. You look great, Mason said as we sat down. The new apartment must agree with you. I had specifically not told them anything about my new living situation, and I wasn't planning to start now. How have you been? I asked instead. They told me about school, their classes, their social lives. Jake was doing better academically now that he was spending more time actually studying instead of partying in my apartment. Mason had started dating someone seriously, a girl who kept him grounded and focused. The court-ordered counseling had apparently been helpful. They talked about learning to recognize their patterns of behavior, understanding how their actions affected other people, and taking responsibility for their choices. The counselor helped us understand that we had been treating you like a parent instead of a sister, Jake said. We expected you to take care of us and clean up our messes, and that wasn't fair. We were acting like teenagers even though we're adults, Mason added. We never learned how to handle our own problems because we always had you to fall back on. It sounded good. It sounded like real self-awareness and growth. What happens when you graduate? I asked. Where will you live? How will you support yourselves? We've been working on that, Jake said. I have an internship lined up for this summer that could turn into a job offer. Mason is looking at graduate programs that offer assistantships. We're not going to rely on family to support us anymore, Mason said. We need to build our own lives. The conversation lasted 2 hours, and by the end of it, I was cautiously optimistic. They seemed different, more mature, more self-aware, more respectful of boundaries. Can we do this again sometime? Jake asked as we were leaving. Yes, I said, but slowly, and with clear expectations about what this relationship will look like. Over the next few months, we slowly rebuilt a connection. Monthly dinners at restaurants, occasional phone calls, text messages about their lives that didn't involve asking for favors. They never asked for my address. They never showed up unannounced. They never requested money or help with problems they could solve themselves. When Mason graduated and got into a graduate program across the country, he called to tell me the news and thank me for teaching him that independence was possible. When Jake landed his first real job and could afford his own apartment, he sent me pictures of his new place and joked about how clean he was going to keep it. 6 months after our first lunch, they asked if they could take me to dinner for my birthday. "Our treat," Jake said, "to thank you for giving us another chance." We went to a nice restaurant in Brooklyn, and they presented me with a gift that made me cry. A framed photo of the three of us from years ago, with an inscription that read, "To the sister who loved us enough to let us grow up. Thank you for teaching us that actions have consequences, and that family means treating each other with respect. We know we can never fully make up for how we treated you," Mason said, "but we want you to know that we learned from it, and we're better people because you held us accountable. We're proud to be your brothers," Jake added, "and we hope someday we'll be the kind of brothers you can be proud of too." Looking at these two young men who had caused me so much stress and heartache, who had finally learned to take responsibility for their actions and respect other people's boundaries, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope for our future relationship. We still see each other regularly, but on terms that work for everyone. They've never seen my apartment, and that's fine with me. Some boundaries are worth maintaining even after forgiveness. They've both built successful, independent lives, and they credit the consequences they faced for teaching them how to be responsible adults. Jake is married now and owns his own home. Mason finished graduate school and has a career he loves. And me? I'm still living my best life in my beautiful apartment with Michael, who I married last year in a small ceremony that my brothers attended as respectful, grateful guests who understand that family means supporting each other, not taking advantage of each other. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give people you love is refusing to enable their worst behaviors. Sometimes teaching people how to treat you requires letting them face the consequences of treating you poorly. My brothers learned that lesson the hard way, but they learned it. And our relationship is stronger now than it ever was when I was trying to solve all their problems for them. Family isn't about what you'll tolerate from each other. It's about how you treat each other when nobody's forcing you to stick around. And now, finally, we treat each other like family should.